Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Fake Chats with Andrew Burnett. I'm your host, Andrew Burnett, and today I have a great guest with me, Mark Tapson. He is the Shillman Fellow and a pop culture expert. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So, to begin the conversation, I guess my main question would be, how did you begin learning about pop culture?
Well, I could go all the way back to when I was a kid. I mean, I grew up in the 60s, which was sort of the decade in which pop culture really came into its own and turned into what American culture really is, which is pop culture. And that's really the decade that happened, that all began. So I grew up as a pop culture kid. Much later on down the line, as I became a writer, my whole interest was focused on cultural things. I mean, I my work is generally focused on what I call the intersection of politics and culture, but I've never really been interested in politics uh, per se. I've only been interested in politics insofar as it affects the culture and vice versa. So my writing has always been about ways in which politics and political ideas and ideologies are reflected in the culture, and vice versa.
So your latest op-ed that you just wrote was about the Olympics turning into a demonic pride parade. Share with us a little bit about how you got the idea behind that article.
Well, as everybody, who's been paying attention to the Olympics knows, the opening ceremony was very controversial. I mean, it was essentially, I think, a sort of a 4-hour announcement that the queering of the culture, the queering of Western civilization was in full swing. And let me just pause for a second and mention that queering may or may not mean what a lot of your listeners think it means. Queering actually does not necessarily mean that it's turning everyone gay.
Hmm.
Queering actually means the inversion and the subversion of the culture of everything normal in the culture, everything from our faith and our the nuclear family and our traditions, all of this stuff. The queering of the culture is the subversion of all of that and the inversion of it in order to destroy it all. So I think that that's really what was going on with this Olympics ceremony, which, as I mentioned, a lot of people, I'm sure everybody probably knows by now, featured very provocative, gender ambiguous dancing and bearded drag queens and transgenderism. And of course, most infamously, this blatant parody of Da Vinci's painting The Last Supper with Jesus and his apostles swapped out for a diverse squad of gender bending narcissists, which was very offensive and controversial to Christians, to the 2.8 or however many billion Christians there are around the world. Very offensive. And even though the organizers of the Olympics and the artistic director tried to claim that they didn't mean to mock anyone or offend anyone, it's clear that they did. It's clear that that's exactly what it was all about. Um, as far as the word demonic itself goes, I think anybody who watched that ceremony, whether you're a believer or not, I think the word that probably comes to mind is demonic. It's um, there's something, kind of an undercurrent of evil and darkness that runs through all of it. And I think that's popped up a lot in the culture over the last few years. And I think anybody who's paying attention to pop culture has witnessed some of it. For example, if you've watched awards shows like the Grammys or the MTV Music Awards, you see a lot of performances that not only suggest satanic or demonic activity, but seem to revel in it or even worship it. So it's out there in the culture, and I think it was out there in the Olympic ceremony. And so that's what prompted me to want to write about it, was to say, well, look, this is one of the most watched cultural events of the year, possibly the most, and it's full of this demonic activity that people need to be aware is demonic.
So what do you think led up to this? What do you think caused all of the media to start leaning in this direction per se?
I think it's been an ongoing process in the culture for many decades. I'd say at least 80 years because I'm dating it back to the beginnings of what is called cultural Marxism. And it's really cultural Marxism that has sort of made its way through the culture and changed things in this direction over the course of decades. Cultural Marxism, in case any of your listeners or viewers are not aware of exactly how to define it, Marxism originally was based in the economic realm. Marx was about economics initially. Marxism was about economics. But communism and socialism and Marxism fail dramatically in the economic realm. But when you transfer those ideals, when you transfer that ideology to the cultural realm, it works spectacularly well in terms of indoctrinating or infiltrating the culture and changing people's worldview. And so that's how Marxism has changed the culture, not economically, although that's kind of waiting in the background, but culturally, Marxism has made its way through Western civilization over the last 60, 70 years or so. And so it's been a long, ongoing process, what the Marxists themselves would call the long march through the institutions, by which they mean that this infiltration was in every arena of the culture, news media, education, entertainment, so that now what you see is this, the radical left or the neo-Marxists, however you want to label them, they essentially own the culture. They own pop culture, they own the news media, and education, obviously. So it's been a long, ongoing process of a slow infiltration and a subversion of the underpinnings of Western culture.
I believe one of the saddest parts about this conversation is, when you cut on Disney Channel or things like that for even children's programming, they're integrating their agenda into our kids. And it's even got to the point where you can't watch certain things anymore
Yeah.
without it being there. And I once read a post on Facebook actually a couple months ago about Disney producing a movie, and I haven't seen the movie, but it's about the girl who had a one night stand with Satan. And I'm beginning to think, how much further are we going to allow this dark world to continue on and influence our kids? Because once it gets in their mind, they're going to think, oh, it's okay. And guess what? They're going to start pushing that agenda even further. And eventually, we're going to have a whole generation that's corrupt.
Absolutely right. And I think it's already progressed beyond that. I think we've got at least one generation that's already been corrupted by this. And you're absolutely right about the children's program because they go for the children. That's what they aim for, which is one of the reasons that these elements took over education is to work on the impressionable young minds of students, and not just college students. That's what the danger used to be, was that you would send your kid off to college and he or she would come back a Marxist. Now the indoctrination begins as early as pre-K, and a lot of it comes through children's programming, as you just alluded to, because they know that if they can secure the hearts and minds of the next generation, then they will win, because the rest of us, the older generations, will simply die off. And I can tell you, because I have a lot of kids, a lot of young kids, and I can tell you that my wife and I are careful all the time about what kinds of cultural influences they're exposed to. We actually homeschool our kids, which keeps them, at a distance from a lot of cultural influences. But it's out there everywhere, and you have to be, as a parent, you have to be on guard all the time. Uh, it, it's a scary fight that has to take place every day.
And it's just sad because even drag queens are visiting schools and
Yeah,
libraries, and they're doing story time for kids. And
yeah,
it's I say it's a easy brainwashing concept, because once they get it into your mind, like I said, they're gonna think it's right, and then they're gonna go and
yeah,
do it.
yeah. Well, the goal is to drive a wedge between children and their parents. The goal is to, to get hold of these kids when they're as young as possible and to begin the indoctrination, whether it's introducing sexual ideas to them or ideas about sexuality and gender and changing their pronouns and confusing them about masculine and feminine. If they can do that, if they can drive that wedge between that generation and their parents, then it's all over. It's game over, as you would say. And uh, just I want to get back to something you reminded me of when you talked about the drag queen story hours. Um, speaking of demonic, these drag queens, these are not the drag performances of earlier generations, like the movie Some Like It Hot, with Jack Lemmon, where the characters dressed in women's clothes, and it was a very comic escapade. Today's drag queens look like something straight out of hell. They are demonically, not disguised, but demonically costumed and made up. And it's really frightening and disturbing. And I have to assume, I mean, there's no reason for them to put on this kind of costuming, except that it reflects, I think, a really demonic undercurrent to their whole agenda. And it's scary.
And it's what makes matters even worse is I was watching the news and Kamala's new vice president that she's got. I was doing research behind him, and he's a huge advocate for youth transgender surgeries.
Yeah.
And we must be careful about those kind of things because, if we vote that in the White House, it's liable that there's a whole bunch more to happen behind with that agenda.
Yeah, and Kamala Harris is a big supporter of that too. In fact, she and her, excuse me, her vice president pick, Tim Walz, they're extremely radical. Both of them are they represent the most radical cutting edge of the Democrat Party, which is now largely just completely dominated by the far left. I mean, I actually used to be a Democrat many years ago, because I wasn't interested in politics. I didn't even know, I just kind of absorbed the opinions of my friends. I lived in a total left-wing bubble. I was living in San Francisco. I was involved in music and academia and things like that. So I was completely living in a left-wing bubble and absorbed their opinions. It was only much later in my life when I began to wake up to these realities. But uh, I was what you would call, I mean, I used to be what you would call a classical liberal. And those don't exist in the Democrat Party anymore. The Democrat Party is completely ruled by the far left. And I would say that conservatives are now the classical liberals.
So I must ask, what led you away from the Democratic Party?
That's a good question. There's a long story behind that, and I'll just try to give you the thumbnail sketch of it. As I mentioned, I was working kind of in the arts, and I moved down from San Francisco to Los Angeles and got involved in Hollywood. But strangely enough, I connected with a writer-director. I began working for a writer-director who was conservative. You might not think there are any conservatives in Hollywood, but there actually are quite a few. And I began working on a project with him that turned out to be very controversial. We didn't intend for it to be political, but it was politicized by the left and turned into kind of a front page controversy temporarily. This goes back to about 2004 or so. And it opened my eyes a lot to what the left was actually really like. While I hadn't been paying attention, what the left had turned into in all the years that I'd been ignoring it, I began to realize that the far left was, or the Democrat Party was now ruled by the far left, and that they were crazy and dangerous. And I began to meet actual conservatives for the first time in many years. This friend of mine, and he introduced me to other Hollywood conservatives, and lo and behold, they weren't all knuckle-dragging racists. In fact, they were intelligent, smart, good, decent people. And I got to know them, and it just opened my eyes about the blindness that I had been living in for so long. And I began to really look hard into politics and history in ways with a perspective that I hadn't looked at it before. And it just began to change my mind pretty radically and quickly. And within just a fairly short period of time, I began getting involved in writing articles, political, cultural articles. I don't know if you are familiar with Andrew Breitbart, but Andrew Breitbart, who was a real culture warrior back in the day, probably the original conservative culture warrior, he actually asked me directly if I would write for an up and coming website that he was starting at the time. It's a website that's now called Breitbart.com, but it was originally called something else. BigHollywood.com is what it was called. And I began writing for that. So as far back as 2006 or 7, I began writing for things like that, and then it just kind of took off from there.
Well, Mark, it has been an honor having a conversation with you. Tell our listeners and our viewers how they can find out more about your articles or your writings.
Thanks. The best place to go is my Substack page, and that's marktapson.substack.com, and it's called Culture Warrior. So that's probably the best place to go.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. You have a great day.
Andrew, it was my pleasure and my honor. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.